So you can contact us at comments@insightsintothings.com via email. You can hit us on Twitter at insights_things, or you can check us out on the web at www.insightsintothings.com for all of our social media links. Are we ready?
I think we are.
Here we go. So what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our views, our actions, and our decision-making ability. Scientific research in this area demonstrates how unconscious bias is automatically activated and affects how we think day to day. It also impacts hiring and evaluation processes and contributes to the lack of workforce diversity, and even how we treat others on a personal level. The unconscious part of the concept indicates we're not actively aware of the root of those decisions are impacted by the stories, beliefs, or perceptions we may have of others. Bias implies that we are skewed in some way in our decision making. But unconscious biases are, in fact, not a judgment. Everyone is biased. Each of us holds a set of perspectives that help us navigate a complex world efficiently. Our goal is to bring awareness to the subject that is misunderstood and, in some cases, unnecessarily overcomplicated. We're going to attempt to simplify unconscious bias today. And our hope is that you'll have a better understanding of the concept and some tools for how to think and behave differently.
So what's the impact of bias? Is a small amount of bias really going to dramatically affect your life? The short answer is yes, and the long answer is still yes. Researchers created a computer simulation that showed a 1% bias in favor of promoting men in the workplace. You might think that beginning with the same number of men and women in entry-level positions and applying a 1% bias in promotion wouldn't change the expected 50-50 outcome. In fact, applying a 1% bias in favor of men at every 6-month review for 10 years led to 65% of the most senior positions in the company being held by men. Every decision made about a person, from the time you meet them to when we're hired to the time we're promoted, passed over, get fired or quit, each decision costs us, and wrong decisions send us running to the nearest online employer rating board or college message board to post a negative review, and failure to attend to unconscious bias can even impede positive organizational change and organizational resilience.
The study dealt with bias in the workplace, obviously, and while the initial research simulation was only run at 1%, when you add additional factors to the equation, things get worse. By adding in the bias that occurs when the job description is written, recruiting begins, interviews take place, hiring decisions are made, and then promotions are considered, you can see how the situation compounds. A small amount of bias has a large impact on our lives. The effects are dramatic and exponential. And as we continue to shine a light on unconscious bias, we need to also keep in mind that people are increasingly making decisions about the schools they attend, professions they enter, and job offers based on the institution's reputation diversity issues. As candidates, we have choices. In order to remain competitive, colleges and businesses will need to address each aspect of the process from start to finish. So this kind of became more of an issue recently with a recent ruling from the Supreme Court that we talked about already, in which they shot down the idea of affirmative action that was designed to combat discrimination and bias based on race. What they're talking about with unconscious bias here is something that clearly the court didn't take into account, because the whimsical majority of the court's thoughts were, oh, well, discrimination isn't an issue anymore, and we just need to make it not an issue and make it go away, and we shouldn't have government get involved with that. But unconscious bias says that human beings, by their very nature, are biased. What are your thoughts on that?
I would honestly, agree with the science, obviously. I feel like everybody is biased, depending on, how you were raised, where you grew up, and really what you feel is what you learned was okay and not okay. I'll fully admit I'm a biased person when it comes to my own beliefs, and I can find it difficult to relate to people that don't necessarily share my experiences or have different perspectives. And I'm not saying that we can't, talk to each other even if we have, different beliefs and so forth. It's somewhat difficult when you kind of have a bias against somebody and you kind of have your own perceptions and stereotypes of them in a more unconscious way rather than more or less trying to have it purposefully.
And it's funny because the study almost seems to suggest that conscious bias that we're aware of is better than unconscious bias. Because when you're not aware that you're biased about something, you really can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And that unconscious bias may be something that's enforced from childhood. Maybe it's bias that your parents instilled on you. It could be cultural, it could be religious, it could be any number of things that has just been ingrained in you that you don't realize you have a bias against someone for something.
Yeah, and I feel like especially when it comes to unconscious bias versus conscious bias, it's a lot harder to kind of change your ways or even move past that bias when you don't know that you have it. I think that's kind of an obvious statement, but when you're conscious of a bias you have, you can obviously, that's basically the first step, and you can take steps to eventually overcome that bias. But when you have an unconscious bias to something, it's much harder to actually realize that you had a bias, whether it was something you had through childhood or something that was just ingrained in your mind for however long you really knew. So I certainly would agree with the fact that conscious bias is probably it's probably easier to have, or it's better to have conscious bias. That way you have it and you can improve from it, rather than unconscious bias when you never actually realize it.
And I think the other important takeaway here is to understand that bias is natural.
Mm-hmm.
It's, to a certain extent, it is an instinctive survival trait that humans have had since, we were living in caves. It's that bias, that things that we perceive as being a threat to us or not being advantageous to us for our survival or, for our procreation, for our continued existence, we develop a bias against those things. So we try to weed those types of things out of the group mentality that we're in. Yeah. So it's not unusual to be biased. It's what you do with that bias and whether or not you allow that bias to result in injustices. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that not all biases, at least in that case, are necessarily bad. Yes, you can have biases related to your own survival. It's almost like with fear. I think that fear and bias can are kind of intertwined in some way, where it's you kind of have a fear on something based on a bias you have with it. And some biases, it's okay to have some of them, because it's you feel yes, you can feel threatened by certain things. Obviously, some are certainly a bit more extreme to where you should probably kind of reevaluate it when you can. But an important thing to note is that bias isn't necessarily a negative thing. And if somebody says that you have a bias, I don't think anyone should really be super defensive of it too much.
And you're absolutely right. It's one of those things where just because you're biased doesn't mean you're doing something, you're allowing it to force you into a negative action.
Yeah.
Biases allow us to unconsciously recognize differences in people. And a successful society understands there's differences, racial, religious, cultural, societal, and it's a matter of celebrating those differences. You turn those differences into an advantage for the overall society.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at it as one being superior over the other.
Yeah.
A lot of times, the differences that our biases key on are complementary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people, when they look at it from a discrimination standpoint, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of bias, the discrimination side of things is where you're recognizing those biases that you have, but then you're allowing them to rule your thoughts and allowing negative outcomes to come from them. Yeah. Whereas, we just had, this is a whimsical example, but we just had rotisserie chicken for dinner. Well, you like dark meat and I like white meat. Okay, they're biases. But that means that when we have a rotisserie chicken, it doesn't go to waste. The whole thing gets eaten at that point in time. So that's just a silly example of how you could take something where someone's biased against something and turn it into a positive type thing.
Yeah.
Do you ever run into bias, or what would be defined as unconscious bias in this case, in your day-to-day activities with friends or at school or out and about if you're in the mall or something like that? Have you ever experienced anything like that?
Yeah, kind of. Now, as much as I, want to say, don't judge a book by its cover or don't judge somebody by their own appearance, I feel like I unconsciously do that in a lot of instances, mainly as a way, of course, to seek out any threats, because sometimes I like to wear more bright and colorful stuff that might kind of set some people off, because I know it sets certain people off, and I'm worried about interacting or being near people that it would set off. So I kind of have an unconscious bias of, okay, who seems like they would be set off by the way that I look? And again, it's unconscious, and I really don't mean to be, thinking that way, but it's like, it's kind of just how it is for me.
Yeah, and I understand that. I mean, a lot of people unconsciously judge appearances, and I'm a great example of that. I'm 6'4", 500 pounds. I'm an ogre, and I've accepted that, and I look like an ogre, but personality-wise, I'm generally a pretty nice guy to talk to and get along with.
Yeah, and I've also kind of had a similar thing, at least when it came to my appearance, because I've had a couple of people kind of mention it. I normally kind of wear dark clothes, at least when it comes to the winter and so forth. I normally cover up a lot, wearing leggings and a hoodie and such. And I've had multiple people mention that I look depressed that way, or that if I dressed a different way, I would seem happier, which I feel is kind of an unconscious bias on their part to the idea of oh, people who are depressed wear darker clothes and cover up more and don't seem to express themselves through their looks as much.
And that's a great example of unconscious biases. Oh, if you're depressed, just wear something brighter. You'll feel happier. And it's that's not the way that works.
Yeah, same thing with the idea of, oh, if you're sad, just smile more.
Right. Yeah, it's it takes a little bit more than that to solve those types of problems.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to look at some of the different common types of bias when we come back. We'll be right back. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Welcome back to